I was filling up my tank at the Shell on Meridian when I made the mistake of opening Reddit. The post had somehow climbed to the top of my local feed, and I read it twice because the first time didn't seem real. Someone had written that their wife had no idea they'd been bringing someone else home and needed advice on the logistics of not getting caught. The top reply, sitting at nearly 2,000 upvotes, laid it out like a tutorial. Park your car diagonally across both spots in the driveway, and when your wife pulls up and can't get in, she calls you, and you walk out like you're moving the car while the other woman slips out the side. 7 months, the commenter said. Zero suspicion. The replies were full of laughing emojis and follow-up questions, as though it were a productivity hack and not a detailed manual for destroying someone's life. I put my phone in my pocket, finished pumping, screwed the gas cap back on, and drove home on autopilot with the post sitting in my head like something I'd accidentally swallowed. And then I turned onto our street and saw that my husband Ryan's car was parked diagonally across both spots in our driveway, blocking the whole thing, angled wrong in a way I had genuinely never seen him park in 4 years of dating and 3 years of marriage. Ryan was meticulous about the parking. He knew how much I loved the car, a pearl white coupe his mother had helped him pick out for my 30th birthday, and he treated my spot like it was an extension of the gift itself, always hugging his side of the driveway, always leaving me more room than I needed, never once crossing the line between his space and mine. He was that way about most things. He was a cardiothoracic surgeon with a schedule that should have made a home life basically impossible, and yet dinner was on the table every night when I got home, and he remembered every work deadline I mentioned, once in passing, and he texted me at 2 p.m. on Tuesdays, because early in our relationship I'd told him Tuesdays were hard and he had simply never forgotten. People like that didn't do what the Reddit post described. I knew that. I knew it the way you know something you've built your life on top of. And I also could not make myself pull into the driveway, could not make my foot move from the brake, could not talk myself down from the image of that post overlaid on top of Ryan's car, sitting crooked wrong at the end of our driveway in the early evening light. I parked on the street 2 houses down. I sat in the car for a moment that was longer than I'd like to admit. Then I got out and walked back to our building, let myself into the lobby, and took the stairs instead of the elevator because the elevator felt too loud, which was not a rational thought, but nothing about the next 10 minutes was rational. I used my key on the front door with the slow, deliberate care of someone trying not to make a sound, easing it open and stepping inside and standing in my own entryway like a person who didn't belong there. The living room was empty. The hallway was empty. I stood very still and listened to the apartment and heard nothing except the ambient hum of the city outside the windows and the faint sound of something on the stove. I went to the bedroom first, pushing the mostly closed door open slowly, already composing the excuse I'd give Ryan for coming in quietly. I was tired. I thought he might be napping. Something low stakes and believable. The bedroom was empty. The bed was made with the precision Ryan brought to everything. Throw pillows arranged in a way I never bothered with, the duvet smooth and unwrinkled. I checked the bathroom, the guest room, the small office we'd argued about whose furniture would go where, and eventually filled with evidence of both of us. Empty. 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 The apartment was exactly as tidy and exactly as quiet as it always was when Ryan had been home for a while. Because he was the kind of person who found a cluttered space genuinely difficult to decompress in, and I had always loved that about him, and right now I was standing in the guest room closet doorway cataloging it as a possible sign of something sinister, which told me everything I needed to know about what that Reddit post had done to my brain in the span of 20 minutes. The kitchen door opened and Ryan came out in the navy apron his sister had given him as a joke 3 Christmases ago. The one that said chef's kiss on the front that he wore without a trace of irony, because he found it genuinely funny. Carrying a ceramic dish with both hands and stopping short when he saw me standing in the hallway. Real surprise crossed his face, the unguarded kind that a person can't manufacture on short notice, before it settled into a smile. He said I was early and set the dish on the counter and told me he had one more thing on the stove and to give him 10 minutes. I looked past him into the kitchen where a pot was simmering and a cutting board had herbs on it, and the whole apartment smelled like the rosemary chicken he made when he sensed I'd had a heavy week, which he had an uncanny ability to detect even when I hadn't said anything. I told him I'd wrapped up early at the office. He nodded and turned back to the stove and told me to go sit down. I didn't sit down. I leaned against the doorframe and watched him move around the kitchen with the unhurried efficiency of someone who'd been cooking long enough to have stopped thinking about it. And I tried to locate the specific thing that still felt wrong. Because something still felt wrong. And I could not determine whether the wrongness was in the room or entirely inside my own head where I'd been quietly catastrophizing since the Shell Meridian. I asked him, as evenly as I could manage, why he'd parked the way he had. He turned around with the slightly embarrassed expression he got when he'd done something impractical in the service of being efficient, and explained that he'd been running behind getting home and hadn't wanted to waste the 2 minutes straightening out the parking job when he knew I'd be hungry when I got in. He'd just left it and run upstairs. He'd fix it after dinner, he said, and turned back to the pot. It was a completely reasonable explanation. It was, frankly, the most Ryan explanation possible. The man had once left a cart full of groceries in the parking lot of a Whole Foods because he'd gotten a text that I was getting home early and wanted to have the chicken done before I walked in, and had gone back for the groceries afterward, and had told me this story with the calm conviction of someone who had made an obviously correct decision. His entire philosophy around my eating was that my blood sugar dropping was a preventable problem, and that preventable problems were his personal responsibility to prevent. And I had told him many times that I was a grown adult capable of eating a granola bar. And he had listened to this every time with genuine patience, and then continued making sure dinner was never late. The parking explanation fit him perfectly. I knew it fit him. I stood in the kitchen doorway and watched him finish cooking and could not fully release the tightness in my chest regardless. Dinner was everything I would have ordered if he'd asked, which he never needed to because he already knew. He served my plate and sat across from me and was partway through telling me about a resident who'd impressed him during rounds when his phone rang and his whole face made the subtle shift it made when the hospital was calling. The warmth didn't leave exactly. It just moved somewhere interior, and what remained on the surface was the surgeon, focused and already elsewhere. He stepped away from the table and I heard him say yes and a room number and then that he'd be there in 20 minutes. He came back and apologized and said it was a patient who'd coded and that he was the only one available and he was sorry about dinner. He kissed the top of my head with the automatic tenderness of someone who has done it 10,000 times, and was out the door in under 2 minutes with his coat half on, the way he always left for emergencies. And then the apartment was quiet and I was sitting in front of a full plate of rosemary chicken and the silence in that post, still lodged somewhere behind my sternum like a splinter I couldn't locate to pull out. I did something I'm not proud of. I went through the apartment again, more carefully, with no excuse this time because Ryan wasn't there to need one. I checked the bathroom trash can, which contained 2 cotton pads and an empty tube of the toothpaste he liked. I opened the closet on his side and looked at the shelf where he kept things. His watch box. A stack of novels he'd been meaning to read for 2 years. The shoebox where we kept important documents together. I pulled back the duvet and looked at the sheets and then sat down on the edge of the bed with my face in my hands because the sheets smelled like his laundry detergent and the specific faint cedar of his side of the bed, and there was nothing there. There had never been anything there, and I had just performed a methodical search of my own home, based on the testimony of a stranger on Reddit, and a parking job that my husband had explained to my face with an expression I had seen on him 1,000 times, and knew to be genuine. I sat on the edge of the bed for a while. Then I went back to the kitchen, alone, and ate the dinner he'd made slowly and without much appetite, and did the dishes he hadn't had time to finish, and sat on the couch with a book I didn't read and waited for him to come home the way I always did when he had late surgeries. He got in at 2 a.m. He came through the door quietly, shoes off in the entryway, and found me on the couch and sat down next to me and put his head back against the cushions and closed his eyes. Emptied out in the particular way long surgeries left him. Not beaten, just thoroughly used up. He said the patient was stable without me asking because he knew I always wanted to know. I put the book down. I had spent 4 hours rehearsing how to bring up what I needed to bring up, and none of the versions I'd practiced sounded like anything other than what they were, which was a confession wrapped around an accusation, so I stopped trying to make it sound better than it was and just told him. I told him about the Reddit post. I told him about pulling up to the driveway and feeling my stomach drop. I told him about parking 2 houses down and coming in through the front door like I was trying to catch something, and checking every room, and the second, more thorough search while he was at the hospital. I told him about the sheets. I told him everything in order without softening any of it, and I watched his face the whole time. He didn't get angry. He was quiet for a long moment and then he said, very calmly, that he'd known about the second search when he came in. The duvet had been slightly off in a way he recognized, because he'd made that bed that morning and he always made it the same way. He said he wasn't angry. He said he wanted to understand one thing, and the question he asked was not what I'd expected. He asked what it was, exactly, that had made a comment by a stranger feel more credible in that moment than 7 years of evidence sitting right in front of me. I didn't have a clean answer. What I had was the real one, which was that love doesn't make fear smaller. It makes it bigger because the more you have, the more there is to lose, and fear doesn't wait around for a reasonable evidentiary threshold before it starts working on you. It pattern matches and catastrophizes and takes the worst available interpretation of a crooked parking job and runs with it, and knowing that about yourself doesn't make it stop. He listened to all of that without interrupting. Then he said, quietly, that he parked crooked because he was worried about my blood sugar. That was the whole story. That was the only story. We stayed on the couch for a long time after that, the lamp on low, the city outside doing its 2 a.m. thing. He fell asleep sitting up the way he sometimes did after long nights, with his head tipped back and his breathing going slow and even, and I put a blanket over him and went to stand at the kitchen window for a while. Outside, his car was still parked diagonally across both spots in the driveway, exactly where he'd left it in his rush to get upstairs and start dinner before I got home. I looked at it for a moment. It was just a car parked badly by a man who'd been in a hurry to feed his wife. It had always been just that. Everything else had been entirely mine to carry, and I needed to figure out what to do with that. Not tonight, but soon, honestly. And with more courage than I'd managed at the Shell on Meridian with my phone in my hand and my tank full and all that quiet anxiety looking for somewhere to land.